The laughter arrived first, not tentative, not unsure, but immediate and confident, as if everyone at the table already understood what was expected of them. Crystal glasses were lifted, jackets shifted back against leather chairs. Someone leaned forward, amused before the words had fully settled. Dominic Whitlock didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was relaxed, conversational, the kind people trusted without questioning. He rolled the stem of his glass between his fingers and smiled, as if he just offered a clever observation, not an evaluation of a life shared. "Relax," he said lightly. "It's a joke." That was all it took. Men with reputations built on sharp instincts laughed the hardest. Others followed a beat later, catching up, not wanting to be the only ones who hesitated. At tables like this, delay suggested uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous. Tamsin Locke sat beside him, hands folded in her lap. She did not flinch. She did not look away. Her expression stayed composed, not frozen, simply still, as though she were listening more closely than anyone else in the room. One man tilted his head. "A joke?" he said. "That sounded like a countdown." Dominic shrugged. "Easy. All marriages have an expiration date." The laughter returned, louder this time, relieved to be invited again. There are moments when silence is mistaken for agreement, not because it is, but because it is convenient to believe it is. Tamsin did not interrupt. She did not rush to correct him. She let the words rest where they had been placed, like something fragile set down without care. Dominic noticed her stillness then. He leaned slightly toward her, voice lowered just enough to feel private. "Don't start." She kept her gaze forward. "I wasn't planning to—" "Well, don't," he murmured. "This isn't the place." She turned to him slowly, not with anger, but with something more precise. "Funny. You didn't think that before speaking." Across the table, someone grinned, sensing momentum. "Come on, Dominic. Be honest. How long do you really give it?" Dominic tapped his glass as though considering a business projection. "A year. Maybe less." A whistle followed. "Brutal." "Honest," Dominic corrected. "She's fine. But we're not exactly on the same level." The table reacted instantly. Approval disguised as humor. Agreement disguised as amusement. Tamsin nodded once, a small, thoughtful motion. Then, "Why wait?" The sound died mid-breath. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It landed clearly, precisely where laughter had been moments earlier. Dominic frowned. "What?" "If you already know it's over," she said calmly, "why waste another year?" A woman halfway down the table froze, fork hovering inches above her plate. Someone shifted in their seat. No one laughed. Dominic let out a sharp breath, half a laugh that didn't land. "Sit down." "No." His smile vanished. "You're embarrassing me." She met his eyes. "You already handled that." "Tamsin," he warned, "this is not the time." "You're right," she replied. "It's the end." The room seemed to close in, not physically but socially. Conversations stopped, attention focused. This was no longer entertainment. "I'll have my lawyer call yours on Monday," she added, tone unchanged. "Enjoy the party." She stood, smoothing her dress, and walked away. No pause, no apology, no backward glance. There are exits that ask to be noticed. This was not one of them. Public spaces teach quiet lessons, not about etiquette, but about power. At tables like this, confidence is often mistaken for authority, and cruelty is dismissed as humor if it arrives wrapped in charm. Silence is praised until it stops serving the person in control. What no one at that dinner realized in real time was that this wasn't a breakdown. It was a decision already made, finally spoken aloud. Tamsin did not leave because she was hurt. She left because clarity had arrived. Because respect, once publicly dismissed, rarely returns in private. Because staying would have required pretending that laughter had not revealed more than words ever could. When she stepped outside into the night, the valet hurried forward, unsure whether to open a door or ask a question. "I'll walk," she said. Her phone buzzed before she reached the curb. As she moved away from the building, one truth lingered behind her. Some people believe power is proven by how loudly others agree with them. Others learn that real power begins the moment they stop explaining themselves. If you've ever watched someone insult you and call it humor, you already understand what this dinner was. If you've ever realized, too late or too publicly, that someone never respected you, you know why she didn't cry. And if you've ever wondered what happens when someone doesn't beg, doesn't argue, and doesn't stay, that answer is coming. If you've ever mistaken silence for weakness, stay with this story. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. Because some endings don't explode. They simply walk out and change everything that follows. The doors closed behind her without ceremony. Inside, the room would have already begun to recover. Someone would lift a glass. Someone would redirect the conversation. Silence would be folded away as if it had never mattered. That was how rooms like that worked. They absorbed discomfort quickly, especially when it belonged to someone who had chosen to leave. Outside, the night met her without judgment. The valet stepped forward, keys already in hand, his expression unsure.
Ma'am?
I'll walk.
Ma'am, I'll walk, Tamsin said. It wasn't dismissal. It wasn't anger. It was simply a decision. He hesitated, then nodded and stepped back, watching as she moved past him and toward the curb. Her heels struck the pavement with steady rhythm, not hurried, not tentative. Each step felt deliberate, as though her body had already agreed to something her mind had settled long ago. Behind her, the building glowed. Warm lights, tall windows, proof of wealth, of belonging, of status. She did not turn around. There was no shaking in her hands, no sharp breath she needed to steady. The absence of panic surprised even her. What she felt instead was a widening, a quiet space opening where noise had been for years. Her phone buzzed as she reached the edge of the street. She stopped, looked down, and exhaled once before answering. Tamsin, Spencer Hale said immediately. I should have stopped him. She closed her eyes, not from pain, but from relief. It's done. You didn't even hesitate. No, she said. I stopped waiting. Sometimes, the most decisive moments don't arrive with force. They arrive after long consideration, when staying requires more effort than leaving, and clarity replaces endurance. That kind of decision isn't impulsive. It's practiced. She stepped away from the curb as a car passed, its headlights briefly washing over her face before disappearing down the street. The city continued around her, unconcerned, steady in its rhythm. That steadiness matched her own. Tamsin, Spencer said again, quieter now. Are you somewhere safe? Yes. There was a pause on the line. Not an awkward one. A careful one. I've never seen him do that in public before. She smiled faintly, not at the comment, but at how predictable it sounded. He's always done it, she said. Just not this clearly. He didn't mean for it to go that far. That's the part people always misunderstand, she replied. Meaning isn't the same as impact. Spencer exhaled. You walked out. I finished, she corrected. You're calm. I've had time, she said. I just stopped pretending I hadn't. They walked in silence together, separated by distance but aligned in understanding. Spencer knew her well enough not to fill it. There's more, he said eventually. About Dominic. She slowed slightly, listening. Tomorrow, she said. Not tonight. You're sure? Yes. Because whatever information he carried no longer had the power to alter her direction. Decisions made from clarity don't wobble when new details arrive. They simply make room for them. She ended the call gently and slipped the phone into her coat pocket. The night felt open now, not empty. And for the first time in years, her next steps weren't shaped by endurance, but by intention. When people reach this point, it's often mistaken for emotional distance. In truth, it's emotional maturity. The ability to respond instead of react, to choose forward motion without needing chaos to justify it. She walked for several blocks before realizing she had passed the hotel where she had planned to stay. The realization didn't alarm her. Plans, like promises, were flexible once they no longer served their purpose. Her phone remained still in her pocket. No messages, no apologies, no demands to return. That absence confirmed what the dinner had already made clear. When control disappears, concern often does too. She stopped near a small intersection, waiting as the light changed. A couple crossed in front of her, laughing softly, shoulders brushing. She noticed them without comparison. There was no ache attached to the sight, only observation. For years, she had explained moments away. Told herself timing mattered. Told herself respect could be taught if she was patient enough. But patience, she had learned, becomes self-erasure when it's one-sided. Her phone vibrated again. Spencer. She answered without breaking stride. Yes? I know you said tomorrow, he said carefully, but I need you to know something now. She listened. There was another woman. She nodded once, though he couldn't see it. I assumed. You're not surprised? No, she said. I stopped being surprised a long time ago. Silence stretched between them, heavy but honest. He spoke to her the same way, Spencer added. Different words. Same tone. That landed, not as pain, but as confirmation. Patterns don't need repetition to prove themselves. One clear example is often enough when someone is ready to see it. Tamsin ended the call soon after, not because it was too much, but because it was no longer necessary. Growth often shows itself this way, not through emotional storms, but through the quiet recognition that explanations are no longer required to move forward. The cafe was quieter than she expected, not empty but restrained, as if everyone inside had agreed to keep their lives at a manageable volume. Cups clinked softly. A machine hissed and settled. The air smelled warm and familiar, nothing that demanded attention. Spencer was already there. He looked up as she approached, rising halfway from his chair before thinking better of it. You didn't have to come so early. I was awake, Tamsin said, setting her bag beside her feet. It seemed efficient. He smiled at that, though his eyes stayed serious. I ordered you tea. If that's still... It is, she replied, taking the seat across from him. Thank you. They sat for a moment without speaking. Not because there was nothing to say, but because both of them understood what the conversation required. Spencer wrapped his hands around his mug, though he didn't drink. I've been going over what to say, he admitted. Trying to figure out the right way to tell you. There usually isn't one, Tamsin said gently. You can just tell me. He nodded.
Another woman.
I knew.
He nodded once, gathering himself. There was another woman. She didn't blink. I thought you might already know, he added carefully. I didn't know, she said, but I wasn't unaware. That distinction mattered. Awareness wasn't pain. It was pattern recognition. Over time, behavior leaves impressions long before facts arrive. When someone dismisses you publicly, minimizes you casually, and frames respect as optional, the rest is rarely surprising. People often believe clarity arrives with confession. More often, it arrives earlier, quietly, when intuition stops being ignored. Spencer watched her carefully, as though waiting for a reaction he knew might not come. She didn't know about you at first, he said. At least, not fully. Tamsin lifted her cup, letting the warmth settle in her hands. They rarely do. She thought the distance meant pressure, he continued. Work, travel, stress. Tamsin nodded. That's the explanation people are given when honesty would be inconvenient. Spencer hesitated. When she did ask questions, he brushed them aside. Joked. Made it sound like insecurity. Of course he did, Tamsin replied. Calm but firm. That's easier than accountability. He humiliated her too, Spencer said. Different setting, same tone. That landed more heavily than the words before it. Not because it hurt, but because it completed the shape of something she had been tracing for years. So it wasn't personal, she said quietly. No, Spencer admitted. It was consistent. They sat with that truth between them. Consistency was harder to argue with than betrayal. Betrayal could be framed as a mistake. Habit could not. I kept telling myself he was under pressure, Spencer added, that he'd soften once things settled. They don't, Tamsin said. Not when behavior is rewarded. Spencer looked at her then. Really looked. You sound steady. I am, she said, because this isn't about comparison. It's about confirmation. If you're listening, and this feels familiar, you're not alone. Like the story if it's resonating. People often wait for proof loud enough to justify leaving. What they forget is that patterns reveal themselves gradually, long before they announce themselves clearly. Learning to trust those early signals isn't cynicism, it's self-respect developing in real time. Spencer leaned back slightly, as if giving the moment space. Can I ask you something? You already are, Tamsin said, not unkindly. When did you start knowing? He asked. Not about her specifically, just knowing. She considered the question, not because it was difficult, but because it deserved precision. It wasn't a moment, she said. It was a collection. A collection of what? Interruptions, corrections, being spoken for. She paused. Laughter at my expense that everyone else was expected to share. Spencer nodded slowly. You noticed before most people would. I noticed, she said. I just explained it away. For how long? Long enough to learn the cost. He watched her closely. Most people would be angry. Anger would mean this surprised me, she replied. It didn't. She set her cup down gently. What hurt wasn't the other woman. It was realizing how often I'd been edited out of my own presence. Spencer exhaled, as though something heavy had finally been named. You never confronted him. There was nothing to confront, she said. He was consistent. I was the one negotiating with that. They sat quietly again, the kind of quiet that follows honesty rather than avoidance. People often wait for evidence dramatic enough to force a decision. What they don't realize is that intuition gathers information long before facts arrive. Learning to listen to that process doesn't make someone cold. It means they've learned to value their perception without needing external permission. Spencer broke the silence first. I should have told you sooner. Tamsin looked up. You're telling me now. That matters. He studied her expression, searching for resentment and finding none. You're not asking details. I don't need them, she said. Details would personalize something that was never personal. He treated you differently, Spencer said, uncertain. Didn't he? She considered it. He treated me earlier, she replied. That's the difference. Spencer frowned slightly. Patterns don't begin at their worst, she continued. They begin small, interruptions, jokes that land only one way, moments where you're expected to accept less and call it understanding. So the dinner wasn't an exception, she said. It was repetition with an audience. That settled between them, undeniable. He believes confidence excuses everything, Spencer said quietly. And people reward it, Tamsin replied. Until they don't. She gathered her things, movements unhurried. What matters isn't that he did this again. What matters is that I no longer need it explained. They stood, chairs sliding back softly. At the door, Spencer hesitated. You're certain about what comes next? I'm certain about what doesn't, she said. And that's enough to move forward. People reveal themselves long before they confess. The challenge isn't recognizing that truth, it's trusting yourself when you do. Growth often begins when someone stops demanding a different outcome from familiar behavior and starts choosing environments where respect doesn't need to be negotiated. By the time Dominic returned to his office, the dinner had already been filed away in his mind as an inconvenience rather than a rupture. He loosened his tie, scanned the city from the windows, and reminded himself of what had always steadied him. Results. Public moments passed. Markets didn't. The analyst was already waiting when Dominic entered the conference room, a tablet resting flat on the table. Two other executives sat nearby, quiet, attentive. Let's make this quick, Dominic said, taking his seat. I've got another call in 10. The analyst nodded. The Horizon contract. Yes, Dominic interrupted. We were favored. We were, the analyst said carefully. but the board awarded it elsewhere. Dominic leaned back, unimpressed. Who blinked? No one, the analyst replied. It went to Locke Strategic. Dominic laughed once, sharp and dismissive. That's not real competition. The analyst tapped the screen. A presentation appeared. Clean, precise, familiar in a way Dominic didn't immediately place. She launched quietly, the analyst continued. Clients like her approach. Dominic's smile thinned. She's doing this to spite me. No one responded. Silence once again filled the room, not in agreement but in restraint. And in professional settings, unchallenged assumptions often survive longer than truth, especially when confidence speaks first. Dominic reached for the folder the analyst had slid across the table but didn't open it. He didn't need details yet. Details were for people still deciding what something meant. Let's be clear, he said. This isn't about capability, it's emotional. She's reacting. One of the executives shifted slightly. The client cited alignment, he offered. They said, Locke Strategic asked better questions. Dominic waved a hand. Questions don't close deals. Authority does. The feedback was specific, the analyst said, choosing his words. They felt understood. Dominic smiled, thin and confident. That's temporary. People like novelty. They'll come back when they want scale. No one argued. Not because they agreed, but because challenging him had never been efficient. His certainty had a way of ending conversations before they began. Still, as the screen refreshed with numbers and projections, Dominic felt something unfamiliar tighten briefly in his chest. Not fear, not doubt, something closer to irritation. He ignored it. When success has always followed confidence, it becomes easy to mistake dismissal for insight. Over time, that habit teaches people to protect their assumptions rather than test them, and the cost of that lesson usually appears later, when correction is no longer optional. The meeting continued, but the energy had shifted. Charts appeared. Projections adjusted. Names were mentioned and dismissed with efficiency. Dominic listened with half attention, nodding at the familiar rhythms of explanation. This was his terrain. Numbers had always bent in his favor eventually. Do we need to respond publicly? One executive asked. A statement, maybe? Dominic scoffed. Why elevate it? She's gaining visibility, the analyst said. Not loudly. Consistently. That's a phase, Dominic replied. It burns out. The room stayed quiet. Not a single voice echoed his certainty. No one corrected him either. Silence once again took its place at the table, but this time it carried distance instead of compliance. Dominic noticed it then. The lack of reinforcement, the absence of laughter. He straightened in his chair. This doesn't change anything, he said more firmly. We're still the standard. Heads nodded. Notes were taken. The meeting moved on. Yet, as the conversation drifted forward, Dominic felt the faint pull of comparison. Not admiration, not respect. Awareness. The kind that arrives when something familiar begins to feel less guaranteed. Confidence often assumes agreement when it hears none. Over time, that assumption becomes isolating, creating rooms where silence feels safe for everyone except the person who mistakes it for loyalty. The meeting ended without ceremony. Chairs slid back. Tablets closed. People filed out with practiced neutrality. Dominic remained seated. The analyst hesitated at the door. Should I prepare a response strategy, in case they ask for comment again? Dominic stood. There's nothing to respond to. Yes, the analyst said carefully. Of course. When the room emptied, Dominic returned to the screen. The presentation from Locke Strategic still glowed there, measured, precise, unfamiliar, only because he had never expected to see it. She learned that from me, he muttered, though no one was there to hear it. He told himself this was temporary, a reaction, a phase. He had always believed time corrected imbalances. That success naturally gravitated back to its rightful center. What unsettled him wasn't the loss itself. It was the realization that something had moved forward without his approval. For the first time, comparison entered his thinking, disguised as irritation. He labeled it arrogance in others. He called it perspective in himself. People who are accustomed to influence often confuse it with permanence. When change arrives quietly, it's easy to dismiss it, until dismissal becomes the reason it continues. Awareness delayed doesn't stop consequence, it only ensures it arrives when adjustment is harder. The mornings came first. Not dramatic ones, not the kind fueled by adrenaline or urgency. Just quiet, deliberate hours that began before the city remembered itself. Tamsin liked that part of the day best. There were fewer voices competing for attention, fewer assumptions waiting to be met. She sat at a small desk by the window, sleeves rolled up, coffee cooling beside her untouched. Pages filled steadily, not with ambition, but with decisions she had postponed for too long. Which clients she would accept, which work she would decline, which standards were no longer negotiable. This wasn't reinvention, it was alignment. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number. Graham Ellison. Spencer suggested we talk. I'm free at 7 if that works. She considered it for a moment, then replied, 7 works. They met later that morning in a shared workspace that asked nothing of anyone except presence. Graham arrived on time, not early, not late. He extended his hand without ceremony. Tamsin, he said, I've read your outline. Then you know what I'm not building, she replied. He smiled slightly. That's why I'm here. They sat across from each other, laptops closed, no pitch, no performance. I'm not interested in noise, she said. Only traction. Good, Graham replied. Noise wastes energy. This was how it began. Not as a response to loss, but as a commitment to clarity. When people stop reacting and start choosing with intention, progress tends to look quiet from the outside. Yet it's often the most sustainable kind. They didn't start with resumes. Graham leaned back slightly, hands folded, eyes attentive but unassuming. You don't need scale yet, he said. You need precision. That's my conclusion as well, Tamsin replied. I'd rather say no often than yes carelessly. He nodded once. That will limit attention. I'm comfortable with that. Most people aren't. They confuse visibility with progress, she said. I don't. Their discussion moved carefully, not because either was guarded, but because both respected the weight of decisions made too quickly. They spoke in measured phrases, each listening fully before responding. You're not angry, Graham observed at one point. No, Tamsin said. I'm finished. He studied her expression, then smiled faintly. That's different. It changes the work, she said. They talked through structure, not aspirations. How teams would be built, how feedback would be handled, how authority would be distributed rather than hoarded. I won't manage through pressure, she said. I've seen what that creates. Short-term obedience, Graham agreed. Long-term disengagement. They both paused at that, recognizing shared understanding. Trust didn't form through disclosure. It formed through alignment. No one tried to impress the other. There was no need. They were evaluating the work, not each other. The days that followed took on a steady rhythm. Tamsin worked from different locations, not out of restlessness, but intention. A table near a window, a borrowed office for a few hours, spaces that allowed thinking without interruption. She drafted proposals that were clear about what they offered and equally clear about what they refused to become. Graham reviewed everything without commentary until it was necessary. This section, he said once, turning his screen slightly toward her. You could promise more. I could, she agreed. But I won't. Why? Because expectations outpace delivery when promises lead, she said. I'd rather reverse that. He considered it, then nodded. That will slow growth. Yes, she replied. And protect it. They spoke often but briefly. Updates, not explanations. Adjustments, not defenses. When something didn't work, they noted it and moved on without assigning weight it didn't deserve. You're not chasing anyone, Graham observed one afternoon. I'm not interested in proving anything, she said. I'm interested in building something that lasts. That distinction shaped every decision. Pricing stayed firm. Client intake remained selective. They declined opportunities that offered exposure without alignment. Progress showed up quietly. A recommendation here, a follow-up there, work that led to more work, not because it was loud, but because it was effective. When effort is guided by clarity instead of reaction, growth becomes cumulative rather than exhausting. Sustainable work is often built this way, through choices that prioritize consistency over recognition and substance over speed. Their meetings grew less frequent, not because momentum slowed, but because systems had begun to hold on their own. One evening, they reviewed quarterly projections side by side, screens reflecting soft light across the table. The numbers weren't dramatic. They were stable, predictable, in the best sense. "This is working," Graham said. "Yes," Tamsin replied, "because it isn't rushed." He glanced at her. "You trust the process." "I trust the structure," she said. "The process follows." He smiled slightly at that. Most people try to reverse it. They packed up without ceremony. No lingering. No need to extend the moment. Their collaboration didn't depend on constant affirmation. It relied on mutual respect and shared standards. At the door, Graham paused. "If this grows, the pressure will change." "I expect it to," Tamsin said. "I won't." He nodded. "That's rare." "So is consistency," she replied. There was no subtext in the exchange, no promise implied, just acknowledgement of alignment. What they were building wasn't fueled by urgency or reaction. It was shaped by decisions made early and upheld daily. Trust, when established professionally first, tends to translate into resilience rather than dependence. People often mistake intensity for connection. In reality, the most durable partnerships begin quietly, grounded in clarity, boundaries, and respect. That kind of foundation doesn't demand attention, but it supports everything that follows. The conference hall was busy without feeling chaotic. People moved with purpose, badges swinging lightly against tailored jackets, conversations overlapping in practiced tones. Screens flashed schedules and panels. This was a familiar environment for Tamsin, though she experienced it differently now. She wasn't here to be evaluated. She was here to contribute. She stood near one of the side corridors, listening as a client finished a point. "We appreciated the way your team reframed the problem," he said. "It changed how we approached the decision." "That was the goal," she replied. "Clarity saves time." He nodded, satisfied, and stepped away as another group approached. Tamsin adjusted her folder and turned, then stopped. Dominic stood a few feet away. He looked the same, immaculate, controlled, comfortable in spaces that had once defined him. But something about his posture was different, less assured, as though he were measuring instead of assuming. "Tamsin," he said, as if the name belonged to him by habit. "Dominic," she replied, polite and neutral. "I've been meaning to speak with you," he said. "You're everywhere today." She glanced past him at the hall. "It's a conference." He smiled, thin. "This company of yours, it's quite the performance." She studied him for a moment, not reacting. Around them, people passed without noticing the shift. Public moments often disguise power changes until someone names them. When roles change quietly, recognition tends to lag behind reality. Learning to stand calmly in those moments, without explanation or defense, is often the clearest sign that authority has already moved. "A performance?" Tamsin repeated, her tone even. Dominic nodded, encouraged by her engagement. "You know what I mean. Timing, visibility. It's impressive, I'll give you that." "I didn't ask for a review," she said. He chuckled softly, as if easing tension. "You always were good at presentation." She met his eyes then, not defensively, clearly. "You're mistaking consistency for display." His smile tightened. "You didn't have to do all this." She tilted her head slightly. "Do what?" "This," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the hall. "The company. The attention." Her voice remained steady. "You don't get credit for my clarity." The words landed cleanly. No sharp edge, no emphasis. They simply replaced his narrative with something sturdier. Dominic blinked. "I didn't say I—" "You implied it," she said. and I won't carry that. For the first time, he hesitated. I taught you a lot. Yes, she agreed, and I learned what not to repeat. People moved around them, unaware that a quiet recalibration was taking place. Dominic shifted his stance, as though searching for familiar ground. I underestimated you, he said. Yes, she replied. Silence followed. Not the obedient kind he once relied on, but the sort that confirms a boundary has been set. When people outgrow environments where they were once diminished, conversations often reveal more about the speaker than the listener. Growth doesn't require permission, and clarity doesn't owe anyone acknowledgement for arriving. Dominic searched her face, as if waiting for something else. Anger, satisfaction, a sign that this moment meant more to her than it did. When it didn't appear, he straightened. Well, he said, forcing a lighter tone. Good luck. Thank you, Tamsin replied. Enjoy the rest of the conference. She stepped past him, not abruptly, not dismissively, simply forward. He remained where he was, watching as she joined another conversation, her attention already elsewhere. For a brief moment, he considered calling after her, not to apologize, not to explain, to reassert something familiar. But the moment passed, replaced by the quiet awareness that whatever authority he once assumed no longer applied. Tamsin didn't look back. She continued through the hall, exchanging brief greetings, answering questions with ease. The encounter didn't linger in her thoughts. It didn't need to. Its purpose had already been served. There are moments when distance doesn't require movement, only understanding. When someone realizes they've outgrown the role another person still expects them to play, separation becomes simple. If you've ever outgrown someone who underestimated you, share this story. Growth often looks like restraint rather than triumph. It shows up when someone chooses not to argue with outdated perceptions and instead invests their energy where it's recognized. Moving on doesn't always require closure. Sometimes it only requires clarity and the willingness to keep walking once it arrives. They didn't discuss the conference right away. They sat across from each other in a quiet corner of a restaurant neither of them had chosen for its reputation. The lighting was soft enough to disappear into the background, the kind of place where conversations didn't need to compete. You handled that well, Graham said eventually, not looking up from his menu. It didn't require handling, Tamsin replied. It required accuracy. He glanced at her then, curious. You didn't feel the need to explain yourself. No, she said. That phase passed. A server arrived, took their order, left them alone again. The silence that followed felt different from others she'd known. It wasn't waiting to be filled. It was simply present. You know, Graham said after a moment, some people mistake calm for distance. I've noticed, Tamsin replied. They expect intensity to mean sincerity. And you don't? I think intensity often masks instability, she said. Consistency tells me more. He smiled slightly. That's not a popular view. It's a practical one. They spoke about work next. Not strategy or outcomes, but process. How decisions felt when they were right. How resistance often appeared when boundaries were first introduced. I don't need reassurance, she said at one point. I need reliability. That narrows the field, Graham said. It's supposed to. He considered her words, then nodded. I appreciate knowing where I stand. So do I, she replied. Nothing in the exchange hinted at urgency. No one leaned forward to close distance. No one claimed ground that hadn't been offered. What existed between them felt intentional, not reactive. In healthy connections, safety often arrives quietly. It shows up as permission to remain whole rather than pressure to perform. When people learn to recognize that difference, they stop confusing emotional intensity with depth and begin choosing relationships that support growth instead of replacing it. They walked afterward, not far, just enough to let the evening loosen its grip. The street was active but unintrusive, the kind of place where movement didn't feel like pressure. Graham broke the quiet first. Can I ask you something? You usually do, Tamsin said. He smiled at that. Do you trust me? She didn't answer immediately, not because the question startled her, but because she took questions seriously when they mattered. I trust the work, she said finally. He accepted that without flinching. And the people doing it? Trust grows there, she replied. When consistency shows up, that's fair. They stopped at a corner, waiting for the signal to change. Graham watched the light, not her. I'm not interested in being needed, he said. I prefer being chosen. Her expression softened, not with sentiment, but recognition. So do I. He glanced at her then. That wasn't always true for you. No, she said. I used to think connection required endurance. And now? Now I know endurance is only useful when it's mutual. They crossed together, unhurried. There was no declaration between them, no framing of what this was or might become. The absence felt deliberate, almost protective. They were allowing space for understanding to arrive without being pushed. I don't want to rush clarity, Graham said. I won't confuse speed with certainty, Tamsin replied. That mutual restraint shaped the distance between them, not as hesitation, but as respect. Neither reached for reassurance. Neither tested the other with expectations. Healthy trust often begins this way, named carefully, allowed to develop through action rather than promise. When people learn to distinguish between being needed and being chosen, they move away from dependency and toward partnership. That shift doesn't announce itself loudly. It simply creates room for something steadier to take hold. Their collaboration settled into something quietly dependable. They didn't text to check in. They didn't fill gaps with updates that didn't matter. When they spoke, it was because there was something worth saying. That choice alone set the tone. One afternoon, they reviewed a draft proposal side by side. Graham paused at a section, reading it twice before speaking. This is solid, he said, but it could be sharper if we add urgency. Tamsin shook her head. Urgency invites shortcuts. Clients respond to pressure. Clients who need pressure aren't our clients, she replied. He considered it, then smiled. You're consistent. So are you, she said. You don't push when you disagree. I prefer understanding why first. That, more than agreement, earned her attention. They worked in parallel for hours, comfortable in silence, exchanging notes without commentary. When the meeting ended, neither suggested extending it. The work was done. That was enough. Later, as they packed up, Graham spoke again. You know, most people interpret space as disinterest. I used to, Tamsin admitted. Now I see it as respect. He nodded. Space allows people to remain themselves. And see who stays, she added. There was something grounding in that exchange. No one tried to define what this connection was becoming. No one reached for reassurance when it wasn't offered. They trusted the rhythm they were building. Safety often reveals itself not through intensity, but through predictability, through knowing that silence won't be punished and presence won't be demanded. When people stop mistaking constant contact for closeness, they begin forming bonds that don't rely on pressure to survive. That kind of connection doesn't collapse when attention shifts. It strengthens because it was never built on control. They finished the day later than planned, not because work dragged on, but because decisions had been made carefully. As they stepped outside, the air felt lighter, the city settling into its evening pace. Graham paused at the entrance. You don't ask for reassurance, he said. I don't need it, Tamsin replied. I need alignment. And if alignment changes, then I adjust, she said. I don't negotiate myself anymore. He smiled, not in admiration, but respect. That makes things simpler. It makes them honest. They walked a short distance together before stopping. There was no expectation that the moment needed to stretch into something else. I'm not here to replace anything, Graham said. I wouldn't allow that, she replied gently. What ends should stay ended. He nodded. I like that you don't confuse partnership with dependency. I've learned the difference, she said. One expands you, the other shrinks you. They stood there briefly, neither rushing to leave, neither trying to prolong the moment. When she finally turned, it felt complete, not interrupted. Tomorrow, he said. Yes, she replied. Tomorrow. She walked away with the quiet certainty that nothing was being taken from her to create this connection. It added to her life rather than filling a gap. That distinction mattered. Healthy bonds are built on choice, not need. When people learn to value stability over intensity and consistency over control, they stop seeking completion from others and start sharing from wholeness. That kind of connection doesn't demand promises to feel real. It proves itself through respect, one decision at a time. The headlines didn't arrive all at once. They appeared gradually, threaded through industry briefings and morning summaries, easy to miss if someone wasn't paying attention. Dominic noticed them because he still read everything. Habit, he told himself. Diligence. Lock Strategic secures multi-year advisory deal. Emerging firm challenges legacy consulting models. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, then clicked away. One article didn't mean anything. Trends took time. But the mentions continued. Different outlets, different language, the same name. An assistant hovered near the door. "Should I flag these?" she asked. Dominic shook his head. No. Let it run. By afternoon, the comparison pieces started appearing. Not hostile, not celebratory, analytical, measured, the kind that lingered. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, eyes returning to the largest screen. Lock Strategic wasn't framed as rebellion. It was framed as alternative. That distinction unsettled him more than criticism ever had. "She's positioning carefully," he muttered. No one answered. Dominic had always believed success announced itself loudly. That influence needed spectacle to hold. Watching another company advance without posturing challenged that belief in a way numbers alone never could. Progress that isn't reactive tends to draw attention without demanding it. When results accumulate quietly, they often redefine standards before anyone realizes a shift has occurred, and by then, comparison becomes unavoidable. By evening, the office had emptied. Dominic remained, jacket draped over the back of his chair, tie loosened but not removed. The screens stayed on, each one displaying variations of the same message he had tried to dismiss all day. Charts showed shifts in client movement. Timelines showed momentum building elsewhere. Commentary avoided his name entirely, which unsettled him more than criticism would have. He clicked through another report, jaw tightening. "They're framing this like a trend," he said aloud. The room offered no response. For the first time, he noticed how quiet his office felt when no one was there to mirror his confidence back to him. The silence wasn't agreement. It was absence. His phone buzzed. A message from a senior partner. "We may need to reassess positioning." Dominic didn't reply. He stood and moved closer to the window, city lights stretching out beneath him. Once, those lights had felt like validation. Now they felt distant, indifferent. "She wouldn't have gotten this far without me," he said quietly, as though stating a fact. Yet even as the thought formed, it faltered. The work on the screens didn't reference him. The strategies didn't echo his language. The growth didn't trace back to his influence. Success that no longer seeks approval can feel personal to those who once assumed authority over it. When recognition shifts away from familiar figures, it forces a difficult reckoning. Influence doesn't persist by default. It must remain relevant, or it moves on without explanation. By evening, the office had emptied. Dominic remained, jacket draped over the back of his chair, tie loosened but not removed. The screens stayed on, each one displaying variations of the same message he had tried to dismiss all day. Charts showed shifts in client movement. Timelines showed momentum building elsewhere. Commentary avoided his name entirely, which unsettled him more than criticism would have. He clicked through another report, jaw tightening. "They're framing this like a trend," he said aloud. The room offered no response. For the first time, he noticed how quiet his office felt when no one was there to mirror his confidence back to him. The silence wasn't agreement. It was absence. His phone buzzed. A message from a senior partner. "We may need to reassess positioning." Dominic didn't reply. He stood and moved closer to the window, city lights stretching out beneath him. Once, those lights had felt like validation. Now they felt distant, indifferent. "She wouldn't have gotten this far without me," he said quietly. as though stating a fact. Yet even as the thought formed, it faltered. The work on the screens didn't reference him. The strategies didn't echo his language. The growth didn't trace back to his influence. Success that no longer seeks approval can feel personal to those who once assumed authority over it. When recognition shifts away from familiar figures, it forces a difficult reckoning. Influence doesn't persist by default. It must remain relevant, or it moves on without explanation. Dominic stood where she had indicated, hands loosely at his sides, posture careful. The confidence he once carried so easily now seemed rehearsed. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for how I spoke, for how I handled things." Tamsin closed the folder she'd been reviewing and met his gaze. "Say what you came to say." "I regret it," he continued. "I didn't see what I had. I didn't listen." She studied him for a moment, not searching for sincerity, only clarity. "Regret doesn't rebuild trust," she said. His expression tightened. "I'm not asking for anything." "That's good," she replied, "because nothing is available." He nodded slowly, absorbing the boundary. "You've done well." "Yes," she said. "I have." The exchange settled into silence, not hostile, not charged. Simply final. Dominic glanced around once more, as though committing the space to memory. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. "You did," Tamsin replied. "And I outgrew that." He left without argument. Tamsin returned to her work, the interruption already losing relevance. Some conversations arrive too late to change outcomes. They exist only to mark distance, not repair it. Accountability delayed often transforms into reflection rather than resolution. When people learn that growth continues regardless of who acknowledges it, they stop waiting for apologies to move forward and begin measuring progress by the strength of what they've built, not by what was lost. The days after Dominic's visit passed without disturbance. Tamsin noticed the difference immediately. Not relief, she had already processed that, but lightness, the kind that follows closure, earned through clarity rather than confrontation. Work resumed its familiar rhythm. Decisions moved forward. Nothing circled back. It was Graham who acknowledged the shift first. "You seem settled," he said during a late afternoon review, eyes still on his screen. "I am," she replied. "There's nothing pulling at me anymore." He nodded, understanding the weight of that statement without asking for details. They finished the agenda in silence, efficient and unforced, then closed their laptops at the same time. As they stood, Graham hesitated, not uncertain, deliberate. "Can I ask you something unrelated to work?" She looked at him. "You can." He took a breath, not to prepare a pitch, but to ensure honesty. "I think we've built something solid professionally. I don't want to disrupt that. But I'd like to explore what comes next." Carefully. She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. "What does next mean to you?" she asked. "Conversation," he said. "Time, no assumptions, and no urgency." She added. "Yes," he agreed. "No urgency." She smiled, small but genuine. "That sounds reasonable." They walked out together, not as a transition into something undefined, but as a continuation of what already worked. There was no claim being made, no expectation placed, just an invitation offered cleanly, without leverage. Healthy progress often begins this way, when interest is expressed without pressure, and connection is framed as an option rather than a solution. When people learn to invite rather than insist, they create space for choice, which is where genuine connection tends to grow. They chose a place nearby, quiet enough to hear themselves think. No reservations, no ceremony, just a table by the window and time they hadn't needed to negotiate. Conversation moved easily, touching on work only when it mattered, drifting instead toward observations, how the city felt different at night, how habits changed when pressure eased. Graham listened more than he spoke, and when he did, it was with precision. "You don't fill silence," he said at one point. "I don't fear it," Tamsin replied. "It tells me where I am." He smiled. That explains a lot. When they stood to leave, neither rushed for coats or doors. The pause between them wasn't hesitation, it was awareness. Graham shifted slightly, close enough to register, far enough to allow choice. "I want to be clear," he said. "We can stop here." She met his eyes. "I know." He waited. The decision came from her body before her thoughts tried to narrate it. She stepped closer, lifted her hand to his collar, not to pull, just to steady, and leaned in. The kiss was unhurried. No urgency. No claiming. It carried the ease of something chosen rather than needed, held for a moment longer than habit, then released without disappointment. When she pulled back, he didn't follow. He searched her face instead. "That was intentional," she said. "Yes," he replied. It was. Moments like this matter because they reframe intimacy. When connection grows without pressure, it allows both people to remain present rather than perform. Choosing closeness without obligation teaches a quiet lesson. Desire is most sustainable when it's rooted in agency, not absence. They walked afterward, not because the evening required it, but because neither felt ready to end the moment abruptly. The street was calm, offering enough movement to keep the world present without intruding. Graham broke the silence first. "Thank you for choosing that," he said. Tamsin glanced at him. "For waiting?" "For deciding," he replied. "They're different." She considered that. "I wanted it," she said simply. "That matters to me now." "It should," he said. "It changes everything." They stopped near the corner where they would part. No lingering uncertainty hung between them. No attempt to secure the future with words. What existed felt complete on its own. "I don't need promises," Tamsin said. "I need room to keep choosing." "You'll have it," Graham replied, "whether this grows or stays exactly as it is." She smiled, appreciative of the absence of persuasion. "That's why this works." They stood there a moment longer, neither reaching, neither retreating. When she finally stepped back, it wasn't a withdrawal. It was a continuation of herself. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. "Yes," she replied. "Tomorrow." She walked away without looking back, not because she needed distance, but because closeness no longer required proof. The kiss hadn't changed her direction. It had aligned with it. Relationships that grow from choice, rather than need, tend to feel steady instead of consuming. When people are allowed to lean in without pressure and step back without consequence, connection becomes something they participate in, not something they depend on. That balance doesn't dilute intimacy. It strengthens it because it's built on agency, not fear of loss. Years later, the ballroom felt different, not because it was smaller or quieter or less refined, but because perspective had shifted. Tamsin stood near the center of the room, listening as a speaker wrapped up closing remarks. The crowd responded warmly, not with excess but with recognition. People approached her afterward, measured and respectful, conversations rooted in shared work rather than curiosity. She moved easily among them, posture relaxed, attention present. Nothing about her suggested arrival. She had already arrived long ago. At the edge of the room, Dominic stood alone. He hadn't planned to attend this event until the invitation appeared on his calendar, forwarded by an assistant who didn't know the history. He recognized the name immediately. He recognized the symmetry too. When their eyes met across the room, neither reacted quickly. Tamsin gave a small nod. Polite, complete. Dominic returned it, slower. No conversation followed. None was needed. The absence didn't feel unresolved. It felt accurate. There are moments when time completes what explanation never could. Distance does the work that dialogue once promised. Growth redraws the room, quietly rearranging who stands at the center and who observes from the margins. When people evolve without bitterness, closure tends to arrive without ceremony. It shows up as neutrality, proof that nothing is owed and nothing remains unfinished. Dominic stayed where he was as the room shifted around him. He noticed the way people approached Tamsin, not urgently, not with spectacle, but with intention. They waited their turn. They listened when she spoke. The attention wasn't drawn by status alone. It was anchored in trust. He remembered a time when rooms had tilted toward him like that, when introductions were made with his approval in mind. Watching the balance move felt unfamiliar, not painful, just undeniable. A man beside him leaned over. "That's Locke," he said. She's built something solid. Dominic nodded. Yes. She doesn't speak often, the man continued. But when she does, people adjust. Dominic didn't reply. He had once believed influence depended on command, on filling silence, on being the loudest presence in a space. What he saw now challenged that belief. Authority didn't announce itself here. It settled. Across the room, Tamsin laughed softly at something someone said, then redirected the conversation back to work. She didn't linger. She didn't need to. Watching her, Dominic understood something he hadn't before. Roles don't reverse through confrontation. They change through consistency, through choices made long after the audience has stopped watching. People often assume power shifts when someone is taken down. More often, it moves when someone builds forward, leaving others to recognize the change only after it's already complete. Dominic shifted his weight, glass untouched in his hand. For the first time, the memory returned without defensiveness. Not the headlines, not the contracts, the dinner, the sound of laughter that had felt harmless to him then, the ease with which he had spoken, certain the room would carry him. He saw it clearly now, not as a single moment, but as a pattern he had refused to question. It hadn't ended that night because of embarrassment. It had ended long before, in smaller moments he had dismissed. Interruptions framed as efficiency, corrections delivered as humor. Silence interpreted as agreement because it was easier that way. Across the room, Tamsin adjusted her stance as someone thanked her. The movement was subtle, practiced. She didn't scan for approval. She didn't need to. Dominic exhaled slowly. He hadn't lost her when she stood up. He had lost her every time he laughed instead of listening. Every time he chose comfort over curiosity. Every time he assumed presence meant permission. Realizations that arrive late tend to come quietly. They don't ask for response. They don't offer correction. They simply settle, leaving understanding where certainty once lived. Growth doesn't always announce itself through change in others. Sometimes it shows up as recognition, too late to alter outcomes, but early enough to teach what not to repeat. Tamsin moved toward the exit when the event began to thin. There was no rush in her step, no sense of departure needing emphasis. Goodbyes were exchanged easily. Promises were made and understood as professional, not personal. When she reached the doorway, she paused briefly, not because she felt pulled back, but because she noticed Dominic standing there again. Their eyes met one last time. She gave the same polite nod as before. No warmth withheld, no message implied. Dominic returned it, this time without hesitation. She turned and left. He remained where he was, not watching her go, but standing with the understanding she had already earned. Nothing more was required of either of them. Some endings arrive without reconciliation. They don't need it. Closure doesn't always come from shared conversation. It often comes from internal clarity. When respect is finally understood after it's been lost, it teaches a lasting lesson, not about regret, but about attention. People don't leave because they're pushed away in a single moment. They leave because they stop being heard over time. And those who learn that truth too late carry it forward, not to reclaim what's gone, but to recognize what must be protected next. Tamsin didn't build her life to punish anyone. She built it because she finally believed herself. And that belief was enough. Some lessons don't arrive through confrontation. They arrive through distance. What unfolded between them was never about a single night, a single sentence, or a single decision. Those moments only revealed what had already been present. The truth had been there in the pauses that went unacknowledged, in the jokes that landed at someone else's expense, in the assumptions that replaced curiosity. What ended the marriage wasn't humiliation. It was the steady absence of listening. Cruelty is often mistaken for confidence because it speaks quickly and rarely doubts itself. It fills space, commands attention, and borrows laughter to sound legitimate. Confidence, however, doesn't need to diminish anyone else to stand. It doesn't rely on an audience to feel secure. When confidence is real, it leaves room. When it isn't, it takes it. Silence is often misunderstood as weakness because it doesn't interrupt. It doesn't correct immediately. It observes. But silence can also be a form of assessment. It can be someone gathering information, recognizing patterns, and deciding what no longer deserves explanation. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's preparation. Power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't warn before it changes direction. It doesn't ask permission when it outgrows a room. Real power moves quietly. It shows up as consistency when reaction would be easier. It chooses clarity over control and direction over validation. It doesn't linger where respect has to be negotiated. It builds forward, often unnoticed at first, until the shift becomes undeniable. Dominic believed influence was permanent because it had always answered to him. He learned, too late, that influence survives only where attention is paid. Authority erodes when listening stops. By the time recognition returns, access often has changed. Tamsin didn't leave to prove anything. She didn't build to compete. She didn't succeed to be seen. She moved forward because she understood something many people take years to learn. Staying where you are diminished is a choice, and leaving doesn't require permission once clarity arrives. Growth rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine, like decisions made early and honored daily, like boundaries that don't need defending because they're no longer challenged. It looks like choosing environments where respect is standard, not requested. This story isn't about winning. It's about alignment, about the quiet strength it takes to stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, about the courage required to choose stability over intensity and self-trust over familiarity, about recognizing that being heard consistently matters more than being noticed occasionally. Some people confuse attention with importance. Some confuse familiarity with loyalty. And some only recognize value once it no longer depends on them. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Midnight Story Vault. Some stories aren't meant to entertain alone. They're meant to remind us who we are.